rainy day can ruin a picnic or be a great blessing if your garden's been thirsty after a drought. The same with water on your property. If you have a babbling brook like this one flowing into a tranquil pond, it's wonderful.
Or you can have problems if you're trying to grow the wrong plants in a wet spot.
Now, the neat thing, though, is that even those problem spots can be turned into assets if you know what to do with them. I'm Barbara Damrosch.
And I'm Elliot Coleman. Stay with us for the next half hour, and we'll show you how to take advantage of the wet spots on your property.
On Gardening Naturally. Hey, how's it going?
Oh, wet but successful.
This is a part of our yard that we're just now starting to work on. It's the wet spot. In springtime, a lot of water drains down from under that fence and collects here. We talked a long time about what to do with it. Elliot had some things that he wanted to grow that really didn't want all that much moisture, so we thought of perhaps diverting some of it.
Well, we are diverting some of it. I've dug a little ditch here so we can drain the wet corner of the lawn, but we also wanted to put in raspberries and blueberries below the garden. And that got really into the wet area, so that it was necessary to get some water out. The raspberries want good drainage. The blueberries, they can stand a little water around them.
Yeah, but notice that he said a little water. A lot of people think that blueberries like to grow right in the water because our Native American high bush blueberry actually grows in swamps. But if you look carefully about the way it's growing, it's up on little hummocks within the swamp. Its roots aren't right down there in the water.
And in order to get the water out of here, we took the first simple step. We dug a ditch. Although we did it with a lot of thinking beforehand. We paid attention to the natural lay of the land. In other words, we watched where the water went when it drained through here. And then we put our ditch where the water naturally wanted to go. But the difference now is that the water is moving through here about 12 to 14 inches lower than it was before. And that's what's making the difference in draining this land alongside where we wanted to put the blueberries and then higher up the raspberries. Now, when we finish this, I will slope the sides of this ditch so it won't erode, it'll look nicer. And then Barbara and I will probably plant some interesting plantings along here. And we both like open ditches, but there are times when they're inappropriate. And so in this case, we put in a culvert, and we will be covering it with soil. That's because we wanted to move from one side of the property to another. Eventually, we'll cover it a little deeper, and then we can grow grass or almost any other type of shrubs on it. Now, over at the upper end, I have another type of ditch. In the case of this ditch, which is draining a corner of the lawn, I never planned for it to be open. It was always going to be covered. And so the material I'm using is what's called 4-inch perforated drain pipe. It has little holes through it that lets water in so the water can then drain down the length of the pipe and out. But in order to make it work, you have to lay it in a special way. You have to put it in with crushed stone like this underneath it to make a nice bed for it to sit on. And then when you lay the pipe into the trench, you put more crushed stone on top of it. To a height maybe an inch or two above it. Now, then the soil is going to go back in. Ideally, this pipe would be a lot deeper, but I don't have that much slope here to work with, and I've had to make a compromise. Now, before I fill this ditch, there's one further consideration. I want to separate the soil on top from the stones below, because otherwise the small soil particles would fill in and the drainage wouldn't be as good. Traditionally, that was done with a layer of straw, but what I'm going to use is some leftover floating spun-bonded fabric from the garden. It's perfect because it lets moisture pass. I can lay it in here right over the stones and then put soil on top. Ideal drainage. Now, we're not going to drain this whole area. Barbara wants a site for some moisture-loving plants.
That's right. We cut down some big trees here that were shading the house and the garden, and this gives me a perfect opportunity to plant some things I've been dying to grow anyway. As you can see, we channeled the water a little bit so that it would run down this little slope into Elliot's big ditch. But it's still quite moist, but that's okay. I've chosen a bunch of native shrubs that like a spot like this. Right here, I have a plant called red-twigged dogwood, Cornus sericea. And that's why I've chosen it, because of these great red twigs. When there's snow on the ground, I'm going to be able to see that all the way from the house. It'll stand out beautifully. It's not going to get terribly tall, but it's going to spread out in a thicket. I've got more of them on the other side of the little stream, and they'll form a dense twiggy mass. Now, next to that, right up the stream a little bit, is a plant called rhodora. It's a native deciduous rhododendron, small shrub, maybe about 3 feet tall at its maturity. I've got a pink one and a white one. Upstream from the rhodoras, I'm trying out a native azalea called swamp azalea. Now, that certainly sounds like something that would do well with wet feet, doesn't it? Rhododendron viscosum. I've got some on either side of our little streamlet, and those should be very pretty when they bloom. I'm planting some red chokeberries, Aronia arbustifolia. And I'm planting those for the red berries because I like to look at them in the wintertime, and also because the birds appreciate them. I also think I'm going to plant a winterberry beyond that, Ilex verticillata, which also likes wet soil and has great red berries all through the winter for the birds and for us. Over here is the spot I reserved for my little wet-loving tree. I decided on a shadblow, which will take the part shade we have here, takes the wet feet, nice and hardy, will do fine in this area, and be just about the right size. Won't get more than about 20, 25 feet tall at most. Good understory tree for right here. But I also have to think about what's going right on the ground. I have one little very low-growing shrub here called bog rosemary. Again, auspicious-sounding name. I'm just going to try one of them and see how it does. It's really pretty. It isn't a true rosemary. That name is Andromeda paulifolia. I think they called it bog rosemary because it likes bogs and because the leaves look a little bit like the herb rosemary plant. But this one has mildly fragrant pink flowers. Now, this is a small shrub. It's not going to really get much taller than it is right now. But I need to put some herbaceous plants here, ones that die to the ground in the wintertime. And for that, I think I need to do a little bit of research. I'm going to go to a place where I can see some mature wetland plantings. I'm going to take a trip to Garden in the Woods and look at some of their wet spots and see what they've done with them.
This is perfect weather for the two garden crops that like lots of extra moisture, celery and celeriac. Now, everybody's pretty much familiar with celery, and if you aren't growing it yet in the garden, I encourage you to do so. And I also encourage you to grow celeriac, also known as turnip-rooted celery, because although this isn't as familiar, it's a wonderful vegetable. Now, when it grows, it looks pretty much like celery, although the stalks aren't edible. They're too pithy inside. But that's okay, because the part you eat is this round root that's starting to form here at the bottom. And at harvest time, it looks like this, sort of a delightfully prehistoric creature. When you want to serve it, cut the long stringy roots off. You get a nice round hard knob, which is wonderful in soups, in stews, thinly sliced into salads. It has a great celery flavor and many uses. Celery and celeriac are both basically swamp plants. They like a good, wet, rich soil. So to begin with, put as much organic matter in here as you can. All the extra compost, all the extra decomposed manure, extra peat moss, anything you can to create the richest soil in the garden. In fact, if you have a wet spot in the corner of the garden, it's a great place to grow these. But the second secret is always water. If you've tried to grow these crops and you haven't been successful, water is the thing that is going to cure any problems you have with them more than anything else. Put an extra trickle or drip line through here. Wander out with the garden hose, and every time you come by, give some extra water to the celery and celeriac plantings. They love it, and nothing will guarantee you a bounteous harvest more than lots of extra moisture for these two.
I'm at Garden in the Woods with Heather McCargo. Heather, Garden in the Woods is one of my favorite places to come and see native plants in a really natural-looking setting. So here we are, it's the third week in May. What's going on at the pond?
Well, right on the edge of the pond here, we have a double marsh marigold. It's a cultivar of the single marigold, which is what you'd see in the wild. And it needs to grow right on the edge of the pond, and it blooms for about 2 months.
Wow.
The single species blooms for about a month.
It looks wonderful here. I also love the way they put some blueberries on the pond edge where they're sort of hanging over the pond. It's so nice to see it used as an ornamental plant. People think of blueberries as something you can eat, and they bloom in the spring, they bear in the summer, and then they turn brilliant red in fall.
And birds love them.
And birds love them, that's right. And I see some things beyond the blueberries. What's over there?
Yeah, what you see in the distance is some iris foliage. On the left is the southern blue flag, Iris virginica, and on the right is the European yellow iris.
What's the pink flower beyond that?
That is the swamp pink, Hellonia spallata, which is actually an endangered species, but it's quite easy to cultivate.
Oh, really? Oh, I'd love to try growing that. And what's the yellow?
That's the wild marsh marigold, the single form of the stubble one that we have
I think
here.
I like that one the best, even if I only get to see it for a month. Now, do I have to have a pond to grow all of those, or can I just grow them in a moist spot?
The marigold needs a very moist spot. All the irises and the Hellonius are quite adaptable to a rich garden soil.
Okay. Now, over here, I see what looks like a plant that I just put in my garden in Maine. Can I go see it?
Yes.
Here we go. Rhodora, right?
Right, Rhododendron canadense. And this rhododendron actually prefers to be planted in full sun.
Now, how big is that going to get?
You're looking at a mature plant right here.
It's never going to get any bigger than that.
No.
And what a wonderful, round, compact shape it is. A native, deciduous, flowering rhododendron that doesn't get too big. I'll have to plant more of those. Now, tell me, it's supposed to like wet soil, but it looks like it's growing in just an ordinary bed here.
The water table is quite high here, but like a lot of wetland plants, they actually don't have to be in a wet area if you amend the soil with a lot of organic matter so it will hold moisture. So you could add compost,
manure,
yep,
something like that. Well, that's something that's good to remember with all of these. You know, this pond is beautiful right now, but I'll bet there's going to be a whole other picture in July.
Yes, and you should really come back then because you'll see a lot of turtles and frogs and insects, and a lot more things will be blooming then than there is now.
Well, I'll definitely come back and pay another visit then. Thank you very much.
With garden clothing, you can have a combination of the stylish and the practical. But when it comes to my garden footwear, I definitely opt for the practical.
So do I. If it's mud season in Maine, I need my tall wellies to slog through February, March, April, May. Couldn't garden without them. I used to wear sneakers a lot when I gardened, but I find that sneakers get wet and stay wet. So do work boots.
So when it comes to practical garden footwear, I take my tip from the Dutch. And they have these wonderful wooden shoes that slip on and off. Well, my favorites, which are available from many garden catalogs, are a copy of these made out of a rubber plastic. They're very comfortable. If I get soil in here, I can just take out the insole, hose them out, and put them back on again. But the best thing is, when I come back from the garden, if they're covered with mud or dirt, they're so easy to slip off at the door and not track it into the house.
Welcome back to Garden in the Woods, Barbara.
Thank you. Gee, in mid-July, it looks so different. In the 2 months I've been gone, this has turned into a jungle. The whole pond edge is so lush. There's all of these shrubs hanging over the pond, the blueberries, the chokeberries, the azaleas, and then the contrast with those enormous ferns and the spiky iris and little bits of color, like I see orange Turk's cap lilies and a mass of lavender phytostegia. It's a lovely look.
Yeah, people often have lawn going right up to the edge of their pond, and they miss a lot of exciting diversity, both in plant life and in animal life. We have a lot of frogs and turtles and butterflies and birds that all come and enjoy the pond because of the diversity of plant life. You also notice we've done things like we have that log floating in the middle of the pond where the turtle can bask. And also the fluctuating water level, which is natural in a pond over the season. In the spring, the water level's high, and in the summer, it drops down. And these plants that naturally go along a pond edge are adapted to that changing water level.
Well, I noticed that you even have submerged plants. What are those?
Yeah, that's pickerel weed. And there's a lot of water plants that actually grow right in the water and, again, can adapt to the rise and fall of the water level.
Right, right. Well, now, I'm really interested in getting some flowering plants that I can grow not only around my new pond that we're creating, but also just wet places in the property. What's this great pink thing?
Yeah, that's the swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and it attracts monarch butterflies, so it's a wonderful one to plant.
And this lovely little...
That is lizard's tail, and that's one that needs to be planted right on the pond's edge, and it has that lovely white flower that hangs over. Right over here is a St. John's wort, which is actually a woody shrub, and it has those lovely yellow flowers.
And then a tall yellow plant behind that.
Yep, that's silphium. It's actually a prairie species that grows in moist prairie areas. And like a lot of the plants we're seeing here, they do not all need to actually be in a wetland. They can grow in good, perennial garden soil. There's also some phlox up there, Phlox maculata.
It looks just like garden phlox, but without the mildew.
Yep, that's a species phlox, and it doesn't get the mildew the way a lot of the garden cultivars do.
This is really the purple and yellow time of year. And, those are the butterfly colors. Those are their favorites, and it's probably because there's so many butterflies active at this time of year.
Yep, and on a sunny day, this area is filled with butterflies. In fact, there's a wonderful butterfly plant, Joe Pyeweed, Eupatorium.
Right, it's just starting to open. I have that in my garden. But it's good in a wet spot, too.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the steeple bush, that shrub we saw back there,
the feathery one.
Spirea tomentosa, that butterflies like, too.
And I saw another purpley one that looks like that annual monkey flower, only it's really tall.
Yep, that's one of the native species.
And you have a little low-growing purple iris back there, too.
Iris brevicalis, and that's, I think, the last iris to bloom, actually. This is late July already, and it's still blooming.
Well, now, I see a new color scheme beginning over here. Brilliant red.
Yes, that's cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. That's just opening up, and in another week, the pond will be filled with it. It's actually a short-lived perennial or biannual species, and it attracts hummingbirds, which pollinate it, and it's the most intense red you will ever see. And a lot of these plants used to be common in wetlands, and you don't see them very much anymore. And one of the reasons you don't see them, along with loss of wetlands, is because purple loosestrife has taken over a lot of wetlands. That's why we haven't planted purple loosestrife in the garden here, because it would take over. It's a European wetland plant that is very aggressive in our native wetlands.
Lithrum, and you will see it, hybrids for sale in garden centers that they say will not take over, but I've heard you still have to be cautious.
Yes, it's very controversial amongst botanists and ecologists, and they believe that it is, the garden hybrids are still cross-pollinating with the wild ones and increasing the populations in the wild. And purple loosestrife doesn't have any wildlife value. The birds can't eat it, the turtles, frogs, nobody eats it. So if you have a pond and you plant purple loosestrife around it, you're not going to get the diversity of wildlife that you do when you plant a lot of these species.
You have certainly achieved that here. Lots of different animals, lots of different plants. And you've given me ideas for the kind of world I want to create about my little pond. So I'm going to go home and see if I can put all this to work.
Great.
I wanted to know how to establish those pondside plants that actually are submerged in the water when they're growing. So Heather's going to give me a demonstration about how you plant those. What's this plant, Heather?
This is arrowhead or duck potato.
Oh, why do they call it duck potato?
Because it has a white fleshy root that ducks like to eat. Actually, people can eat it too. It's one of the most important food plants of the Native Americans. Now, what we're trying to do in planting it is we want it to rest on the bottom of the pond and not float to the surface.
Right.
So what we're going to do is tie the plant up with the soil that's in the pot in the burlap with a rock, and then throw it in the water. Now, if we were doing this in the spring before the new leaves had come out, and that would be the ideal time to do it,
right?
Because then the foliage could adjust itself to the water level. We would just have the tuber, almost like a little potato, that we could just tie up in burlap. So now all we're going to do is throw this in the water at the proper depth.
Well, how do you know what that is?
Well, different plants like different depths. This one likes it in the edge in the 1 to 3 foot zone. If it was a water lily, which can grow out in deeper water, we might even go out in a little boat and throw it out from that.
That looks perfect. The leaves are right on the surface. Well, what happens if I try that, though, and it lands on its side or upside down?
Well, the whole point of the rock and the burlap is to weight it down to the ground, and so as soon as the roots go in, it will send up a new shoot vertically. So you might not see the plant for a little while, but it will be fine.
Okay, well, what about my ducks? I have ducks. Are they going to eat my duck potatoes?
Well, again, that's what the rock and the burlap is keeping the potato part down in the ground. But they could, if they're harassing type ducks, peck at the foliage and dislodge it, so you might want to keep them away for a little while.
Until it all gets established.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds easy enough.
Barbara, I really like the wetland plants you got at Garden in the Woods, but I can never remember their names.
Well, that one's epimedium, and the tall one is a flower called fairy bells, and past that is the native wild ginger, and then there's some lady fern.
Okay. You know, like most wet areas, this one looks a lot drier in the middle of the summer. But if you want it to be successful, you have to plant it for the wet period.
And if you choose the right plants, eventually they'll make a nice carpet.
Boy, I really look forward to that happening. But for now, goodbye and good gardening.
Next on TLC, doing something for your home can be easy, even fun. Check and see here on Homebodies. Then, add value to your home with some serious improvements. The Home Pro shows you how.